Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the Benchmade Knives 945, also known as the Mini Osborne or the Mini 940 more colloquially. First off, it's been a heck of a day, so you're in for some amateur hour reviewing here. I'm going to do my best. Next thing, thank you very much to Blade HQ for helping me get this guy across my table, as well as to my Patreon patrons who make the channel possible. Next thing, size comparisons. This is mini, as you might imagine by the name, right? But what we see here is that it's smaller than the Delica in pretty much every measured dimension. Blade shape and size are actually not so far off the Rat 2, but it is still a little bit smaller than that, right? Here it is against the Spyderco PM2, which dwarfs it in pretty much every conceivable way. And then finally, actually, I'll put it up against maybe the most relevant size comparison, which is the Benchmade 940, right? The 940 is a classic, right? In a lot of ways, that's why this knife exists. The Benchmade 940 is one of those things that if you ask a person who's been in the knife community for a while, like, what are the knives that everybody should know about? What are sort of some of the greats, the goats, if you will, in the knife world? The 940 is going to come up pretty regularly, right? It is a really great design, and it's a really great knife, generally speaking. And so, in a lot of ways, it feels very inevitable that Benchmade would do one of these, but a little bit smaller, because the 940 is a little bit bigger. We see this guy coming in just under 3.5 inches, whereas this guy comes in under 3 inches, which is, well, makes it a lot minier, right? But we see here that although the proportions are a little bit different, so it's not just the case that they kind of like and end up with a mini, right? At the same time, that there is definitely, this is always going to be, the mini is always going to be in the shadow of its big brother, so to speak, so that's a thing. And then finally, one stupid note, but a meaningful one. In my disassembly video, I forgot a very important step, which is just lubricate the very back of this blade tang here. Just put a little dot of lubrication right here on this surface, and that will that'll make your action a lot nicer. So if you're watching that after, nonetheless, there you go. Let's go ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this very interesting little knife. Okay, so start with on the good side. This guy is light. Oh my God, is this knife lightweight. I'm going ahead and drop this on a scale here. What we're going to see is we are coming in at 1.98 ounces for just under 3 inches of blade. That's light. This is a very, very lightweight knife, and I'm sure that's going to be something a lot of folks appreciate. Another thing that about 10% of my viewers are going to appreciate is the fact that it is fully ambidextrous. You can mount the clip on either side. The studs are present on either side. The axis lock works from either side. This is a knife that a lefty will have exactly the same experience as a righty with, and that's a beautiful thing. Next thing, this has a two-tone G10 in there. What we see here is that the G10 on the inside is actually a separate blue layer that has been bonded to the black layer. You could probably dye that if you wanted to make it, uniformly black all around or something like that, but I think it actually has it's got a cool little effect, right? Can't argue with that. So, there's that. Next thing, this guy has a very nice action. Out of the box, and especially with a little bit of maintenance, it's good to go. It's not the smoothest thing ever, but I also haven't, used it all that much, and it'll smooth out over time, but it has a very nice action. It's got a nice detent, and, overall, well done. So, no argument there. Next thing, this guy has a standard Benchmade clip, right? It's using their standard pattern, which means that you can probably get a deep carry clip for this guy from Benchmade, and that's a beautiful thing, right? Because it's sometimes useful to be able to carry, especially something small like this, all the way nested deep into the pocket, which is great. And finally, on the good side, the blade on this guy is absolutely fine. It is a reverse Tonto style thing with a little bit of an angle in the back here, and then a nice bit of flat here, a bit of belly, nice pokey tip. The stock is actually a little bit thinner than the full-size 940. It's kind of hard to tell, but it is definitely thinner. I checked it with a micrometer and whatnot. But there is that. And it has a nice little swedge. It's S30V, which is an absolutely fine blade steel, right? And you know what? It's just the 940 blade shape is good, so the 943, or 45 blade shape is pretty good too. So to me, at least, all that is the good, is that it's got a nice fine little blade right here. It's got a standard Benchmade clip, nice action, two-tone G10, fully ambi, and it is lightweight. On the great side, to me, honestly, the thing that is going to sell this knife more than anything else is the fact that it is a small 940. Like I said, this is a classic, and I think that Benchmade is very wise to kind of cash in on that, right? They make this classic knife. Why not make a smaller version of this classic knife that's going to be available to people people who always wanted to try a 940 but lived in an area where there were legal encumbrances, keeping them under 3 inches of overall blade length, right? Or, maybe somebody who's got a million 940 versions already and just wants to try the next one, right? To me, that's the thing that's going to sell this knife more than anything else. People who are already in love with the 940 but want something a little smaller or just something a little different, that's what's going to be appealing to this. And so to me, at least, what's great about this guy is exactly its lineage and the fact that that is well reflected in the design. To me, on the bad side, start with the price on this guy, I kind of am conflicted about. Because, okay, it's the same price as the full-size 940-2, which is the G10 handled 940. And, I'm not one of the people, by the way, who would say, oh, it's a smaller knife, you should pay less. No, I mean, in practice, the material cost is relatively low. It's more about the machining and effort, and I can't see those being that different here. But it is at the same, so, they could have gone higher for some reason, but at the same time, it is also pricier than a lot of the other options, right? The Mini Bug Out is $55 less than this. The Hogue Ritter RSK, Mini RSK, which I think is a competitor, very strong competitor from outside of the Benchmade lineup, is about $45 less. And honestly, if we look at other G10 knives in the range, we're looking at, generally speaking, even nicer steels. So it's one of those things that feels pretty okay for Benchmade, right? And given that the full-size 940 is up to $190 now somehow, but it's just not super competitive against the rest of the market. And so it's kind of tough to evaluate the price, but I would like to see it come down. And that's why this is in the bad. Next thing, on the bad side, I don't quite understand why they launched this in this high-speed, low-drag blue and black sort of affair rather than just going with the classic, right? I think this would have been a lot more interesting to a lot of people with these classic elements, right? With the blue, with the purple, with everything in there. This is the classic 940, and I think this could have been, a little brother would have been much more appealing in that sort of a colorway rather than this tactical sort of affair here. That just strikes me as strange, and honestly, this version isn't super compelling to me. I'm not a super tactical person, so that would make sense, right? But at the same time, yeah, I mean, well, you can't see it on the mat, though, at least, camo. But nonetheless, it's not necessarily great. Next thing, this is a little detail, but it's one that bugs me all the time. If we look inside there, what you're going to see is screws sticking out into the middle. That's this screw, this one under here, and this one. Those screws are too long. And they were on the original 940, although you can't really see it. Actually, they're not on this guy here. Which is actually strange, but that's because it's the aluminum. But they were on the 940-1 that I had. This is just not amazing, right? I mean, this is a little detail here that I don't appreciate, right? If you're going to be charging this much money for this knife, you really need to be hitting all those little quality pieces. They're kind of Benchmade is increasingly embracing a luxury pricing scheme, and honestly, that's not a luxury move, right? You'd want those screws to be just the right size to fit in there perfectly, right? Not important. It doesn't touch the blade, but it doesn't send the right message either. Next thing, this is a little detail, but I've often talked about I don't care for the feeling of being far away from the edge on a pocket knife. As I'm holding it in my hand, I like to be relatively close up to the edge, and this makes me favor solutions with like a finger choil, where the edge is right next to my finger here. But on this guy, actually, this feels like you're very far away from the edge. And what's interesting about it is that you're actually the same distance as the original 940, which does have a little bit of that feeling, but the fact that this wasn't really scaled very differently is not great. I feel like that makes this guy feel a little ergonomically weird, and frankly, the ergos aren't necessarily amazing either. With this particular clip and this part sticking up with no ramp at the, no flat part at the end, you definitely do feel that clip digging in a little bit. It's not terrible, it's fine, but honestly, the ergos in the original 940 are a little bit better for me. And so I don't particularly care for that. And then finally, on the bad side, this guy is still a little bit thick behind the edge. This was one of the biggest and remains one of the bigger faults of the 940, generally speaking, but the grind just isn't all that crazy thin, and as a result, it ends up being not quite a slicing beast. And I tend to be of the opinion that smaller knives should really cut really well, and so if they thin this out a little bit more, this would cut a little bit more effectively and would feel a little bit more interesting, I think, in a market that's very, very saturated with G10 style knives in this way, right? And so I think that thickness behind the edge is definitely one of the problems that the full size has, and I'm sorry to see it's still a thing here. A little better, though, for what it's worth. So, to me, at least, all that is the bad is it's a little thick behind the edge. The ergo's unamazing. You're a little far from the blade with it. The screws are still long inside for some reason. It's a little weird to launch this version rather than just relaunching something looking like the classic here. And $175 is a fine price within Benchmade's lineup, but it doesn't compete well against the rest of the knife world at the moment. On the ugly front, there's nothing particularly ugly here. I mean, maybe those screws on the inside, but it's not a functional problem. To me, let's just go to the final conclusion, and that in a lot of ways, my conclusion is that this is this is both surprising and inevitable at once, right? When this was first announced, it was like, oh, of course. But at some levels, like, oh, wow. Right? It totally makes sense that they would go this route. The 940 is Benchmade's most iconic knife by a mile, right? And it's a design that they've kind of ridden for years. They've made so many variants of it, etc. And, you know, for a lot of people, the 940 is often a first really higher-end knife, and in many cases, the last higher-end knife, right? This is a lot of people's knife for life, and for good reason. And so at some level, given that Benchmade has become a very conservative company, they're really kind of, well, they're doing what they do, and they're continuing to do it, shall we say. It's a little shocking to see them do something that, you know, with this classic design, right? But it also does make sense, right? And the result is actually interesting. The result is something that was definitely eyebrow-raising and made me go out of my way to pick one of these guys up. And, you know, I think ultimately there is a lot of good here with lightweight build, full ambi support, nice G10, a nice action, standard clip, a fine blade, and it is a throwback to a really iconic design. Of course, the price isn't amazing relative to the rest of the knife world. This version seems a little weird to launch with, right? The screws are still too long, you're a bit far from the blade, the ergos aren't awesome, and it is a little bit thick behind the edge. But ultimately, the question to me is whether you need a knife or whether you want the Mini 940, right? If you are a collector of the 940, of Osborne knives maybe generally, the Contigo, etc., and as many people are, and as many people should be, this is a great piece, then this is going to appeal to you. You are probably going to love this knife just because it is in a lot of ways a love letter and a tribute to the 940, right? This has enough of the joy of the classic to feel reminiscent, to have this in your pocket and be like, yeah, 940, right. But it's a size that's going to be more legally interesting to some, and that's going to motivate a lot of purchases. Like, hey, I can get a 940 and I live in, you know, this place. Again, I think they're going to do better with that kind of thing by going to a more lunchroom-friendly version than the high-speed, low-drag version over here. But I think that's going to be interesting. And so for a lot of people, this is going to offer a novelty in the 940 lineup. And if they are collectors of that lineup already, you know what? They're going to like it. It's going to be something that brings them joy. The thing is, though, it's not the 940, but small. I kind of expected that I was going to be in love with this knife because I really like the 940, but it's also a little bit bigger than my usual kind of taste, right? Usually I tend to go for knives closer to 3 inches, and so I figured what's not to like here? But at some level, the apple didn't fall right under the tree, and some of the design decisions of the original 940 don't quite scale down quite as well. Right, it ends up feeling a little bit more ergonomically awkward. I don't know. For some reason, it doesn't quite click with me. Maybe if it were the classic version, it would have enough of the nostalgia there. But so I don't think you should look at this as being just the 940 made smaller in the sense that maybe the Mini Bug Out feels like the Bug Out made smaller. This is a tribute, right? It's not the same song. And in many ways, I don't think it's as good as the same song, but it is a tribute. And it very much, if you love that original song, you're probably going to love this one too. Right, but the thing is, the bigger question for a lot of folks is, well, Nick, okay, sure, you're talking big game about the 940, but bro, I just want a knife. And you know what? There are lots of choices at this price point, right? You know, if you want to stay within Benchmade, you can get the Mini Bug Out, which in a lot of ways is where I'm going to be sending people who talk to me about this probably most often. Because you can get that version at like $119 for way, way less money. You can get the Mini Bug Out Carbon Fiber Elite for $136, which is, again, much less money. You can get the Griptilian 556-1 with the G10 with the 20 CV blade, which in a lot of ways feels a little bit, I don't know, feels a little nicer at this size. I like that design a fair amount. And that's the same price as this guy here. You can get the Mini RSK from Hogue and get 20 CV and whatnot for much cheaper. You can get the TRM Atom and Neutron in this kind of a price range. You can get the Spyderco Chaparral Delica, the the K390 Delica. There are a bunch of knives that you can get for $170 that are going to be really, really, really good for everyday carry and are potentially classics in their own right here. And so ultimately, I think that's probably, I'd probably end up sending people to those other alternatives before I send them directly here if their point is not to get a Mini 940, right? And so ultimately, I think this is a really smart move for Benchmade, right? They're going to sell a bunch of them, and a lot of people are going to love them. And part of it's going to be the nostalgia, part of it's going to be it's a fine design in its own right, but I think this is going to be a piece that's going to be maybe more destined for collectors and for existing fans of the brand and of this knife, rather than the next greatest everyday carry choice for the world as its big brother once was. So there you go. Interesting knife, but in the shadow of its brother, maybe not exactly what I'm after. So I hope this has been interesting to you, and have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day, and I hope yeah, I completely ran out of pun there. I was trying to go with something for Osborne, but it just didn't work, right? It was not born out, I suppose. Not Osborne out. There you go. That's as good as you're going to get today. Have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.